In the fall of 2007, the small town of Stella, Missouri, was filled with the colors of the changing season. But beneath the beauty, a sad story was about to happen. It started on a regular evening when a frantic 911 call broke the calm of the town. The voice on the line was filled with panic. A mother's worst fear had come true. Her daughter, Rowan Ford, a bright-eyed 9-year-old with dreams and laughter, had disappeared into the thin Ozark air. The sudden disappearance of young Rowan filled the community with dread, turning the season of harvest into a time of uncertainty. As the police began their investigation, they encountered a series of unexpected twists that no one was prepared for. Hello, welcome to Maya's Reality Channel, where we bring you compelling true crime stories. From unsolved mysteries to notorious criminals, we leave no stone unturned as we navigate the dark corridors of real-world crimes. Please don't forget to give us a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button for more. Now let's get back to the story. Rowan Ford was born on April 11, 1998, in San Diego, California. Her early years were marked by the pain of her parents' divorce. When she was still young, her mother, Colleen, moved with her to the small, quiet town of Stella, Missouri. Colleen eventually found love again and married a man named David Spears. Blending their families together, Rowan found herself with 2 sisters and 2 brothers. As time went by, they all formed a tight-knit bond, sharing moments of laughter, support, and love. In November 2007, 9-year-old Rowan was in the 4th grade at the local elementary school. Her mother worked the night shift at a store, while her stepdad spent most of his day on the farm. This often left Rowan to fend for herself, fostering a sense of independence in her young heart. On the night of November 2nd, around 9:00 a.m., Colleen came home from her night shift, only to discover that Rowan was not in her room. Panic began to set in as she asked her husband where their daughter was. He calmly replied that Rowan had asked to sleep over at a friend's house, and he had agreed without asking for the friend's name, trusting in the safety of their small town. Colleen's worry quickly escalated as she checked with all of Rowan's friends. Given the town's size, it didn't take long, but none of them had seen her, and she hadn't stayed over at any of their houses. Fear gripped Colleen's heart as she frantically searched the entire town, calling out for her daughter. Returning home, exhausted and desperate, she told David that Rowan was nowhere to be found. She begged him to call the police and report her missing, but he tried to reassure her, insisting that everything was fine and that Rowan would soon be home. As the hours dragged on with no sign of Rowan, Colleen's fear and desperation only deepened. Colleen, unable to shake the distressing fear in her heart, decided to take matters into her own hands and dialed 911. The local sheriff promptly organized a search operation and headed to their house to speak with David, who was the last person to see Rowan before she disappeared. David recounted that on the evening of Rowan's disappearance, he had been working on the farm with his colleague Christopher. Their mutual friend Nathan came by, and the 3 decided to head to David's place to have some drinks and play pool. They stopped by the store, bought some alcohol, and spent several hours at David's house. Later that night, Christopher asked Nathan to drive him home to the neighboring town where his trailer was, and they persuaded David to join them to continue the fun. Before leaving, David checked on Rowan in her room and saw she was asleep. Feeling reassured, he left with his friends. They made another stop at the store for more alcohol and headed to Christopher's trailer, where they continued drinking for about an hour. Around this time, David decided to head home and asked Nathan for a ride. Nathan, quite drunk by then, chose to take back roads to avoid encountering the police. After dropping David off, Nathan drove home, and David went straight to bed. He was soon awakened by Rowan, who asked if she could sleep over at a friend's house. Without much thought, he agreed and quickly fell back asleep. Upon hearing this, Colleen's mind raced with questions and dread. Her instincts told her something was terribly wrong, and the urgency in her voice grew as she relayed David's account to the sheriff. The small town buzzed with the escalating fear of a missing child, as neighbors joined the search, hoping and praying for Rowan's safe return. The police approached David's story with some skepticism. What puzzled them most was the notion that a 9-year-old girl would decide to go to her friend's house in the middle of the night, and that her stepfather would let her go without even asking which friend she was talking about. The sheriff considered the possibility that David might be hiding something or might even be directly involved in Rowan's disappearance, but he had no evidence to support this theory. Police officers and local residents searched the town and its surroundings late into the night. The entire community, knowing Rowan's family well, came together to help. With a population of only about 150 people, news of her disappearance spread quickly throughout the county. Stella was a quiet place where parents felt safe letting their children play outside without worry. Now, with Rowan vanished without a trace and no leads emerging after an entire day of searching, the residents of Stella were in a state of panic. The first day of the search yielded no results, and the following day, November 4th, the police went to the neighboring town to speak with Christopher, who fully corroborated David's story. However, Christopher added that David hadn't contacted him since that evening, and that he had only just found out about Rowan's disappearance. The police expanded the search, involving even more volunteers, but still couldn't find any trace of Rowan or any clues to her whereabouts. The next morning, the FBI joined the investigation. While the local police continued to search throughout the town and its surroundings, detectives focused on exploring the possibility of abduction. They strongly doubted David's story, finding it highly questionable. The small town's atmosphere of trust and safety had been shattered, leaving everyone on edge as they grappled with the terrifying uncertainty of Rowan's fate. The police also checked with all of Rowan's friends and confirmed that she hadn't visited any of them that night. Investigators continued to speak with David, who changed certain details in his story several times, further raising suspicions against him. For instance, he gave conflicting timelines for his absence from home that night and even suggested that perhaps Rowan hadn't asked him for permission to go to her friend's house and had just left without his knowledge. FBI agents discovered that on the night of her disappearance, David had asked his mother to borrow her car, a fact he had initially not disclosed to the police. As a result, they decided to seize both this car and his own pickup truck for examination, but experts were unable to uncover any evidence. Meanwhile, detectives decided to speak with Christopher and Nathan again, as they were both with David that evening. The police invited Christopher to the station, and he repeated the same story as the day before. He also agreed to a polygraph test, which showed no signs of deception. Several hours after Christopher left the station and returned to work, he noticed Sheriff Clark's car and waved for him to stop. Sheriff Mick Epperly, who led the police department in their Wheaton town, had known Christopher for 17 years since his childhood. The sheriff was friends with his foster parents, and Christopher had always respected him, often seeking his advice or help in difficult times, such as when his mother passed away. Sheriff Epperly approached Christopher, and they discussed Rowan's disappearance. The sheriff was aware of the case, but had not been involved in it, as the search was being handled by the Stella Police Department. During their conversation, Sheriff Epperly noticed that Christopher's behavior seemed quite odd, raising his suspicions that Christopher might be withholding some information. Considering that Rowan's life was at stake and her fate remained unknown, Epperly decided to share his concerns with the FBI. He contacted the agents and told them about his suspicions. Investigators assumed that Christopher might be withholding significant information that could implicate Rowan's stepfather, David, in her disappearance. Perhaps David had asked Christopher to lie and alter certain details about the events of that evening, and now Christopher feared being implicated as an accomplice if he told the truth. Sheriff Epperly informed the FBI agents that he had a close and trusting relationship with Christopher and offered to help persuade him to talk. That same evening, Christopher went to Colleen's house to ask if there had been any progress in the search. Around the same time, FBI agents also arrived to speak with Rowan's mother again. When they saw Christopher there, they asked him some questions, and he once again repeated that the events of that evening unfolded exactly as he had previously said. However, for the first time, Christopher mentioned that he did not rule out the possibility of David's involvement in Rowan's disappearance and expressed his desire to help uncover the truth, no matter how terrible it might be. He even suggested wearing a wire to talk to David and try to coax him into confessing, but the detectives decided not to resort to such tactics at that point. Instead, they asked Christopher if he had any locations in mind where David could have hidden Rowan's body, and he named several places. This new development gave the investigation a renewed sense of urgency. The possibility that Christopher might hold the key to finding Rowan spurred the detectives to intensify their efforts. They hoped that this breakthrough could lead them to uncover the truth. The next morning, police set out to search the locations Christopher had mentioned, as well as continuing their search in the surrounding areas of Stella. FBI agents once again brought David in for questioning, but he repeatedly denied any involvement. Detectives also searched his home in an attempt to find any leads, but it turned up nothing. Meanwhile, Christopher went to the sheriff's office to speak with Epperly and told him about his encounter with the FBI. During their conversation, Sheriff Epperly had a strong feeling that Christopher was still withholding something. After their meeting, he contacted the detectives again and expressed his belief that Christopher might be keeping some information that could likely help them prove David's involvement. The FBI agents asked the sheriff to continue trying to persuade Christopher to talk. They believed that Christopher's repeated contact with Epperly to discuss the case indicated that he wanted to share important information but was afraid to do so for some reason. This suspicion created a sense of urgency among the investigators, who hoped that Christopher's trust in Sheriff Epperly would eventually lead him to reveal the crucial details they needed to find Rowan and uncover the truth about her disappearance. The next day, on November 7th, the police called Christopher back to the station. They needed his consent to search his safe located in David's house. Christopher had been living with David for several months when he temporarily didn't have a place of his own, and some of his belongings were still there. Christopher gave them his permission and also agreed to allow the police to search his trailer and his car. He voluntarily provided a DNA sample and agreed to answer the detectives' questions again. They began questioning him about that evening and once again asked him to confirm David's story. This time, Christopher suddenly admitted that his friend's story wasn't entirely true. The investigators began pressing him to tell them what really happened, but this pressure only caused Christopher to become agitated. He said that if the police were going to treat him like a criminal and attempt to accuse him of involvement in Rowan's disappearance, he would not continue the conversation. After that, detectives had to end the interrogation, and Christopher left the station. That same evening, Christopher went to Sheriff Epperly and told him about the interrogation. He complained that the detectives were treating him like a suspect and said that he might need to hire a lawyer. The sheriff replied that it was his right, but asked him to understand that the police were just doing everything possible to find Rowan. In response, Christopher stated that he would no longer speak with them and that if he wanted to share anything else, he would only speak with Epperly. The sheriff continued to persuade Christopher to tell him everything he knew. At some point, Christopher began to cry. He said that he always loved Rowan and would never harm her. During the time he lived in David's house, he developed a close bond with Rowan and the other children. They began to treat him like a family member and even called him Uncle Christopher. The sheriff understood that Christopher was on the brink of revealing everything he knew. However, just as Christopher was about to speak, someone arrived at the police station, distracting Sheriff Epperly for some time. Christopher left the office without sharing what he had intended to do. Sheriff Epperly reached out to the FBI again and told them about this conversation. He explained that Christopher was almost ready to disclose everything he knew, but cautioned that pushing him too hard might cause him to stop talking and get an attorney. Epperly suggested giving Christopher some time to think it over, and the detectives agreed. The search for Rowan continued the next day, again with no luck. But everything changed on November 9th, a week after her disappearance. Search groups reached a remote area near McDonald County, 40 miles from Stella. There, amidst fields and trees, they discovered a large pit in the ground. When they looked there, they found Rowan's body concealed under leaves and debris. She was missing all clothing below the waist except for one sock. Medical experts found signs of strangulation and also determined that she had been sexually assaulted. Shortly after the body's discovery, FBI agents contacted Sheriff Epperly and asked him to speak with Christopher again, hoping he would now reveal everything. The sheriff learned that earlier that morning, Christopher had visited the station when he wasn't there and informed other officers that he needed to speak urgently with Epperly. The sheriff set out to search for Christopher, checking all the places where he might be, but the man was nowhere to be found. The search continued until Christopher called Epperly himself. He was clearly distressed and asked if he was being followed. He explained that after hearing the news about Rowan's body being found, he drove around town to clear his head and noticed a gray car tailing him. Sheriff Epperly replied that he knew nothing about any surveillance and suggested meeting Christopher in person. When they met, Christopher was visibly nervous and expressed concern for his safety. He feared that after Rowan's body was discovered, he might be accused of murder and someone might seek revenge against him. Epperly took him to the station and said that now that the case had been classified as a homicide, it was time to reveal everything he knew. Christopher began crying again, and the sheriff asked him to tell what David had done to Rowan. In response, Christopher stated that there were too many people at the police station and he didn't want to discuss it there. He suggested going to a quieter place and mentioned a small bridge located a few miles from their town. Epperly agreed, and they drove there together. As they got out of the car, Christopher unexpectedly raised his hands and said that the sheriff should handcuff him. The sheriff was surprised and replied that it wasn't necessary, but Christopher said, "After what I tell you, you'll have to do it." After this, Christopher began talking. Adding to the first part of the story, he revealed that he, along with Nathan and David, went to his trailer where they continued drinking. Sometime later, his friends decided to head home, and David asked Nathan for a ride. They said they would take back roads to avoid the police and left. But then Christopher started telling something that shocked the sheriff to the core. He claimed that he wanted to assault Rowan sexually and quickly came up with a plan. Knowing his friends would take quite some time on the road through the fields, he got into his car and drove straight to David's house, taking the main highway. He entered Rowan's room, picked her up, and carried her to his car, doing it all so that she wouldn't wake up. After that, he took her to his trailer, where he assaulted her. According to Christopher, she only woke up at that moment and tried to resist, but she couldn't break free. Christopher didn't turn on the lights or speak to her because he didn't want Rowan to recognize him. After the crime, he planned to take her back home and leave, but things didn't go as planned. When he carried Rowan out of the trailer, the moon was shining brightly, and she saw his face. Christopher panicked, grabbed a rope, and strangled her. When she passed away, he loaded her body into the car and started thinking about what to do next. At first, he wanted to dump her from the bridge, the same one where he stood with Sheriff Epperly, but Christopher realized that her body would be found too quickly, so he got behind the wheel and began driving around the county, considering other options. Soon, he remembered the large pit near the neighboring town and headed there. He dumped the body into the pit and tried to cover it with branches, but the pit was too large, so everything fell down. When he returned to the trailer, he found traces of Rowan's blood on his clothes and mattress. Christopher also realized he needed to get rid of her pants, underwear, and the rope he used to kill her. He collected all these items and placed them in a large barrel, intending to burn them. However, Christopher quickly realized that such a fire would definitely attract attention. So he dragged the barrel into the shed, closed the door, and started the fire there. Sheriff Epperly was completely taken aback by this story. All this time, he thought David had committed the crime and Christopher was just withholding some information. It was hard for him to believe that the man he had known for almost 20 years was capable of such brutality. Christopher himself had 3 young children, although he didn't live with them after divorcing his wife. He always seemed like a decent man to him, but reality turned out to be way more chilling. After Christopher finished his story, he agreed to voluntarily go to the station, and the sheriff didn't handcuff him. Only after they arrived and Christopher repeated his confession to the FBI agents was he arrested on charges of murder. Christopher also signed a voluntary consent to search his trailer and car. Ending his confession, he added that he regretted his actions and said that he cried like a baby all the next day. The detectives immediately went to speak with David and informed him that Christopher had confessed to the murder. Considering David's strange behavior and inconsistent statements, they suspected that he might have been covering for his friend. However, they were met with an even more shocking twist. When David was brought in for questioning, he suddenly changed his version of events. According to him, the night he returned home and found Rowan missing from her room, he realized that Christopher might have taken her. So he took his mother's car and drove to his trailer. Upon entering, he saw the girl on the bed with Christopher leaning over her. Instead of rescuing Rowan, David decided to join in. He also sexually assaulted her and then helped his friend kill her and dispose of the body. David added that during the ordeal, his brain simply shut off, and he remembered nothing about the night for several days. The detectives, who were not expecting such a twist, went back to Christopher to confirm David's words. However, Christopher stated that his friend was not involved and that everything happened as he had told them. This further baffled the detectives, but Christopher's story matched the facts. Medical experts confirmed that the victim had been strangled with a thin rope, a detail only the killer would know. During a search of the trailer, the police found a barrel with ashes, and in his car, they also discovered hair comparable to Rowan's. Despite investigators still being unable to confidently determine whose version of events was truthful, both men provided incriminating statements. So David was also arrested, and the cases were sent to court. During the trial, Christopher filed a motion to exclude all his statements from the case materials, claiming he was unaware they could be used against him, and that the police violated his rights. But the judge denied this motion since all his conversations with investigators were entirely voluntary. Christopher also attempted to plead mitigating circumstances, pointing out his difficult childhood. From an early age, he was constantly shuffled between biological and foster parents, which greatly impacted him. Christopher also invited an expert who claimed he had signs of developmental issues. However, none of this helped him avoid punishment. In 2012, 5 years after the murder, Christopher was sentenced to death. He tried to appeal this sentence, but to no avail. As for David, the situation was much more complicated. He admitted to assaulting and killing Rowan, but there was one serious problem. His version contradicted Christopher's statements. If the prosecution decided to charge David with murder, it could potentially lead to Christopher's sentence being overturned, and David might also avoid responsibility. Considering there was no solid evidence against David, such as DNA, the prosecution could not take such a risk. In fact, they still weren't sure if he was involved at all. The prosecution did not rule out the possibility that David might have indeed committed the crime together with Christopher, but there was no evidence to support this theory. In the end, a difficult decision was made to avoid the risk of Christopher's sentence being overturned. They reduced David's charges to much lighter ones. He pleaded guilty to 2 charges, child endangerment and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 11 years in prison, with a minimum of 5 years to be served behind bars. This sentence was, however, met with outrage because people believed that if David was indeed involved in the murder, his punishment was deemed incomparable to the severity of the crime. However, there's nothing that can be done about it now, and it's unlikely that he will ever be tried again for this case. As for Christopher, he remains in prison awaiting execution. Considering that decades often pass between sentencing and execution, there are no guarantees that the death penalty will ever be carried out. However, it's quite possible that he will spend the rest of his life in prison. So guys, what do you think David may be hiding from the authority? Let us know what you thoughts in the comments section, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more.